In far western New South Wales, water stretches as far as the eye can see. Previously parched land has been rejuvenated by months of flooding, and it's created a smorgasbord for birds, fish and invertebrates. Wetlands are now teeming with life.
What happens in these big floods is that they produce a tremendous flush of things to eat for water birds, everything from small invertebrates to plants to frogs to many fish.
This plentiful supply has triggered one of the most widespread bird breeding events seen in years.
These are really important for the whole range of different water bird species because, they haven't been getting as much opportunity to breed as they did in the past. And so a big event like this essentially allows them to bring back their numbers.
The Lachlan is the fourth longest river in Australia and flows through the centre of New South Wales. At its lower end lie the Boolagul wetlands, nestled on the edge of the arid hay plains in the state's far west. Tucked away from sight, they provide the ideal refuge for birds. Researchers from the University of New South Wales in Sydney visit once a fortnight for 6 months to survey the growing colony. They're monitoring the success of this year's bird breeding and the health of the river system.
During dry years, this wouldn't be wet, so they rely on these big flooding events to fill. So a lot of these wetlands are not always wet.
During these wet years, they're only accessible by boat. It's a long and slow journey in. The water is very deep this year, providing near-perfect conditions for birds to nest.
First you need the flood, then the water needs to stay around, the water needs to stay at the right depth. They require a lot on this lignum, which you can see around us, for nesting material. Then they need all the food supply and things like that.
Jana Stewart and Luke Juilliard are part of the research team. They start by doing a drone survey to examine the colony before tagging nests. Every few weeks, they're checked for eggs.
1 egg. And that's 85.
The team returns to count how many chicks hatch and finally to see if the offspring is thriving. Most of the birds are unfazed by their regular visitors, particularly those who offer a helping hand.
Feels very special, I think, when you come into these places and you're in the middle of, we have sort of between 30 and 50,000 breeding pairs in here, and you're maybe the only person that these birds have seen so far, and seeing some of the chicks hatch in front of you, and it feels very special.
The nests contain either a clutch of eggs or newborns waiting impatiently for breakfast. It can be a jostle for space. With most chicks now hatched, the wetlands have become home to a new generation of a vast array of species.
We have a lot of strawneck ibis in here, as well as royal spoonbills, along with glossy ibis and white ibis, and then there's lots of ducks and other small birds as well. It's really beautiful water in here, and there's lots of fish and frogs and things around.
The birds themselves act like a barometer for the wetlands and other wildlife. If they can breed and raise their young, it means the water quality is high and fish and invertebrates are flourishing.
You have periods of drought, and then these big wet years will come through and they sort of bring everything back to life. So these are really important. All of these birds really rely on these events happening.
It really is a feast for the senses. The smell of fetid water and algae is capped off by a chorus of chattering and chirping birds, all protecting their chicks and hunting for food.
The depth and quality of the water are also tested on each visit. The results are collected and sent to the Commonwealth Environmental Water Holder. This information helps the federal agency manage the Lachlan River catchment. It's used to determine whether more water releases are needed from upstream to maintain the health of the wildlife and the wetlands.
is 2.603.
The critical thing for these breeding birds is they like to be nesting above water, and that's really so that they're protected from predators. This is such a big flood event that it's not really envisaged that we need extra water to get them through.
But the depth of the water can also pose hazards. Some nests have drowned in the major flooding. Sometimes babies are separated from their parents, leaving them to fend for themselves.
We do get nests that get flooded. Generally what happens is that is sort of disastrous for that particular pair of birds and those chicks, but they will generally re-nest because there's so much food around. So, we don't expect it to have a major impact on the overall breeding success and the new generation coming through.
The breeding bonanza being seen at Boligal is being replicated across the Murray-Darling Basin. Professor Richard Kingsford has just completed the 40th annual aerial bird count of Eastern Australia. It monitors around 50 species, spanning 2.5 million square kilometres. The survey has found that while bird numbers aren't as dense as in previous years, they're breeding across a wider area because of the expanse of water. Countless species are enjoying the benefits.
They're very thinly spread across the Murray-Darling Basin at the moment. We find that the water birds are breeding everywhere, and this is, little pairs of ducks and their ducklings. We're finding, big colonies of ibis and egrets and herons in different parts of the Murray-Darling Basin.
The survey visits up to 2,000 wetlands each year as it crisscrosses Eastern Australia. The internationally renowned Macquarie Marshes in the New South Wales Central West are full to the brim. Further west at Lake Brewster near Hillston, it's standing room only, with thousands of pelicans perched on the few slivers of dry land.
It's an extensive flood, certainly not one that I've seen in probably 20 or 30 years. And when the water's widespread as it is, it actually produces this sort of exponential increase in the amount of food that's out there. So it's really good for them to have these sorts of big events because there's so much for not only for them to feed, but to breed up into good condition and then to be able to successfully bring the next generation along.
But this boom comes after several years of bust. Some wetlands have been recharged by intermittent rain and flooding, but Professor Kingsford says it hasn't been enough to maintain, let alone grow, bird numbers.
The capacity to rebound is reduced. So if you can imagine, if you've got fewer birds that are in the system to be able to actually take advantage of a big flood like this, that comes down to the big issue that we've got in terms of managing this system. It's those sort of small to medium floods that we've lost a lot of.
In the centre of New South Wales, near West Wyalong, lies the state's largest natural inland lake. Lake Cowell was empty for 9 years during the Millennium Drought.
Our main bird breeding habitat we lost during that Millennium Drought in 2008. So there was a big area of lignum that is ordinarily safe from flooding that we lost. So that was a big change for the whole lake ecosystem.
Mal Carnegie heads up an environmental trust tasked with looking after Lake Cowell. He's kept a close eye on the wetlands and its wildlife for almost 20 years and has watched its recovery from the drought.
We actually had our flood peak here in Lake Cowell on the 11th of November last year, and it was 30 centimetres above anything that's been recorded in recent times, certainly since the 50s.
Ironically, that was too much water for birds. A flock of about 10,000 ibis nested on Lake Cowell in November last year. It was wiped out by the record flood peak. But there is a silver lining. Mal Carnegie says as other wetlands start to dry up, Lake Cowell will still provide a sanctuary for birds. Even with no further inflows, there will be water here for the next 3 years.
It depends what happens in other areas, but if we go back to a more normal sort of seasonal pattern, I'd expect those areas further west would be drying up, and we'd expect to see greater numbers of birds here. The habitat's going to be in good condition on the back of this flooding, and the water level will be more appropriate for nesting.
As the Lachlan River and its wetlands wind their way to recovery, the future looks bright for the next generation of waterbirds.